What will it take to implement regional clinical governance? Our next speaker, Jean-Louis Denis, will offer you 4 building blocks for how to do that. Welcome, Jean-Louis.
So, bonjour. Don't worry, it will be in quasi-English, and I will do my best. So thanks for the invitation, but I'm also part of the organizing committee, so it's not totally an invitation, but they were supportive that I will try to do this. So I will build on Eve's presentation and Greg's comments, which is and start with his question, how we accomplish this, and that's where we got interested in what we call transformative capacity in healthcare system, and trying to take a broad look at healthcare reform and to understand how government in each jurisdiction tackled the problem of achieving transformation and improvement, because both don't go necessarily together. You can get improvement without dramatic transformation, and you can get dramatic transformation without tangible improvement. So that's the kind of basic assumption behind this talk. And I guess if I push this, so this is the outline, and then introduction and context. And as you know, we have a kind of national sport in Canada, and in many OCDE countries too, is when the hockey season is finished, it's time to launch a new healthcare reform. And we had different periods in our history, like in Quebec, in Ontario too, with the commission on, I think the term was on healthcare restructuring at the end of the 90s, and the book on this is very revealing about the dilemma of driving reform. And in 2012, we were, it's 2012, I don't know why it's 2003, we were invited by GHPPL to do a sort of comparative look at healthcare reform in Canada, in US, and in UK, and trying to mix together what I call the organizational scholarship and the policies and political science scholarship. And in discussing the meaning of reform, we arrive at a very intellectually sophisticated definition, which is the following: a real reform, you should feel this in the way people work and deliver care, and in the way user or patient as an experience of the system. So if reform don't cascade down there, it may be very useful for other purposes, but it won't impact a lot on the way we receive care or population health intervention, I mean in the broadest sense of the term. And people were quite surprised, because you have all very sophisticated definition, and that you arrive with this boring thing. In the end, can we produce something through reform that will impact on quality of care and so on? And then there is this book I think it's 2013, Paradigm Freeze, a very nice book to look at, and it's one of the conclusions of the book relate to Greg Marshall's proposition for Ontario and the LHINs and the budget for physicians. They argue that we are really in a kind of gridlock, because overall, the medical profession is so independent, and Caroline Toey, a very well-known political scientist in Canada, has always emphasized the question of the role of medical profession in transforming or not the system. And I sort of agree with this, but at the same time, I saw movement in healthcare system in the province. So to make the story short, this book is probably written by very clever but more pessimistic people, and the current talk is given by a less clever person but more optimistic. And And one of the things that we often forgot when we discuss this kind of stuff on health system is that we're in a very peculiar policy area. In all other area of so-called social protection, we strive to achieve the minimum for all. And this minimum, we can debate it like minimum wages for all and so on. But in healthcare, we have a very specific pressure, which is, and I agree with this, and I hope for the other area of social protection it can be like this too, but we aspire to offer the best to all, which means that this tension between cost and offering the best and so on, and having impact on the health, on population health, is a tension that we live in our organization, in our daily life as clinician, as manager, as policymaker, constantly. And this we have to, I guess, to keep this in mind. And recently, Saltman and colleague from the European Observatory make a quite nice paper, and again, we don't need to agree with everything, but they say essentially that the kind of public command and control structure or model of organization in healthcare have lagged behind patient and citizen expectation. So there is this feeling that we need to renew the way we work with organization, that we make them accountable without make them suffocating with, I don't know if it's the right term in English, but with too much direct top-down guidance and too much bureaucracy and so on. So we need to make them able to manage, and we need to make them able to channel professional entrepreneurship to achieve better results. So if you fall asleep in the next 30 seconds, this was the second main message of the presentation. Then we go back to our subject, transformative capacity, and we define it as the kind of resources, levers, and practice mobilized at three levels of governance: the policy level, the organization, and the clinical. And as you know, everyone in this room dreams of a better alignment in each of our systems with our variation in province between policy, organization, and the clinical. And more it is aligned, more so-called reform will work. And again, if I go back to Greg and Eve's presentation, it was clear that we need a fit between these three levels. One thing that we may have less recognized through time is that these transformative capacity are not the monopoly of a government or top civil servant, and are not the monopoly of other groups in the system. It is essentially a distributed asset that we have in healthcare system. That's why we tend now to pay so much attention to the synergy between managerial expertise, assets, legitimacy, and clinical skill, expertise, legitimacy. And when we bring both together, we can get what Tom's called network as an example. A network is an organizational form with clinical insight driven by clinical goal and strong collaboration between management and clinician. And you can bring, of course, patient and so on. This is the next stage. So the fourth theme of Today Policy Forum, and again, it was very well staged by Yves, it deals with all these aspects. The first one is really network, and in my word, to get improvement in healthcare, we need to be able to identify the right organizational form and renewing organization accordingly. Networks became very attractive because you can help independent organization or provider working together without asking them to be under a single authority structure. So it brings some flexibility at the operational level and strategic level in the system. Team-based organization and patient engagement, really the idea behind is we have to take work organization important. In any industry, when you try to bring about change, you take work seriously and say, how people work, what they need to learn. Do they need to learn something different to implement effective team-based work, effective interprofessional collaboration, to use data and clinical performance effectively for improvement and so on. And I tend to say that in most of the major reform or ambition to improve system, we generally don't pay enough attention to work, practice, learning, and we always assume that if a policy is well designed, it will cascade down naturally, and people have everything in their work context to implement it and to make the best out of it, which is generally not true, even for an optimistic one like me. Third thing, changing the center of gravity, and I will come back in conclusion, it's really the political economy stuff that Greg and Eve discuss in different terms. And the subtext of this is, at some point, we may do 152 policy forum. We may agree on everything, like most of the people in this room, but if the flow of resources in the system stay the same, and if we compensate organization or professional in the same way, we will be here in 30 years from now, if we have a sufficient life expectancy, and we will still agree without much implementation. And this organization cannot do much around this. It depends about their levers around allocation of resources and so on. And we may come back to this. And the fourth one is that it's the kind of signals that we send to provider, organization, professional people who work in the system. And the only way to send signal is through data on performance and accountability arrangement, which are not necessarily punitive, but you need to receive a signal to practice differently or to reinforce your inclination to do better on a with more consistency in the system. These kind of levers are also used by CFHI in their framework about accelerating and care improvement. So a lot of people got interested in this kind of stuff. And this, you may recognize it, is a map of Canada. And as you know, Canada has a lot of geography and not enough history. So if we start with a well-known province, Quebec, and this is just a snapshot on reform, in Quebec we had a major restructuring April 1, 2015 with massive merger. And we will have Caroline Barbier at the end of the day that will talk about the perspective of a CEO in a, I can say this, in a hyper-centralized system with massive restructuring, but the story is not necessarily a nightmare, and you will listen our viewpoint. And then we have Ontario, and the way and this is, again, it's too simplistic, but we have Ontario with a various set of initiatives that cascade down at least partly from the ECA Excellence of Care for All Act in 2010. And what I get from Ontario is, up to now, it's very different than what we get in Quebec since last April. It's a more focus on trying to play with performance indicator, quality indicator, accountability, and so on. I don't mean that there is no preoccupation for this in Quebec, but it's another pathways to try to achieve transformation that is very different than the infrastructuring of the end of the 90s in Ontario. Then you have the one that take a kind of, and I'm saying it in a neutral way, a kind of dogma, which has this is ups and down to Saskatchewan with the lean. Okay, let's do lean. Let's do lean everywhere, every day, and let's train people to lean. And as you know, there is ups and downs with this, but again, you don't play much with structure. You focus on some process tool and capacity development, and we have something to learn from this. Then we have the soft one, and I'm discussing this with these people, like, again, it's just a label, it's nor negative nor positive. It's Manitoba with primary care network, a very soft approach to try to change things in a very different policy setting, and we're looking at on all these cases with a CIHR grant now. And then we have Alberta, which is a concentration of governments with Alberta Health Services. Maybe some surprise that you create this to reduce politicization in the system, but it may not work totally from what I heard. So there is a lesson there. You can create a large public agency to drive the system. It may be more managerially oriented. It may be a nice idea, but it's very tough in health system because it's over 40% of the budget, the public budget of the province, to say politicians will stay away. This is very difficult to achieve, and if you find a way, you may get a good consulting business. But Alberta create this, but also create, and we refer often to this big network machine that I cannot say if it became possible or nurtured from Alberta Health Services, and Tom's may say more around this, but it became a natural experiment that is very, very interesting for all of us. And then we have BC, which is relatively soft with primary care network, doctors BC on board, their next stage of doctors' engagement in the system for improvement. So, and then we have Nova Scotia restructuring, and I think it was in April, similar than Quebec. So there is something with April and restructuring that we have to understand as researchers. So to make it short, then if I go back, we can describe three archetypes of a province and other jurisdiction, and I think about continental Europe, to address the problem of transforming and improving their healthcare system. The first one, and we know this very well, is massive restructuring. And in a sense, even the NHS, England now, since the Conservative government with the new commissioning and so on, they thought that way. They face major restructuring, and people debates about, can you stop to destabilize the system and please let us work? Because most of our time we spend on trying to accommodate restructuring. So, third message, for if you suddenly wake up, it's restructuring can be good, but in a reasonable dose and not too frequently, please. So that's mode one of reform. A second mode, which is, and if you go back to William James, he was very interested in healthcare reform, as you know. And of course, it's a joke, but it's not a funny one. And And when you're interested in organizational change and system change, and he has this very nice piece on the laws of habit, and he talk about plasticity, and it's amazing because in our CIHR grant, we talk about plasticity, and I wasn't aware of this. And he said, a structure needs, well, I will sort of retranslate in quasi-English, but a structure is a good asset when it's sufficiently resilient, but at the same time amenable to change. So, and that, I think, is what we see in terms of an emerging trend in reform in Canada, is this idea that if we don't do just brutal restructuring, how we will play with the system in a different way to achieve what Stephen Lewis called, we have a system in names only, and Eve's presentation really deal with this idea of creating a system. And a second word of caution with this emeritus health economist, Alan Menard, is it's very easy to rationalize and break the cost curve, in a sense, if I use Greg's term, but it's much more difficult to achieve improvement. And the challenge is controlling the cost curve and achieving improvement at the same time. So that's bring us to a kind of response to at least a partial disenchantment with brutal restructuring and brutal rationalization, which I call a kind of mode 2 of healthcare reform. And one of the very simple ideas is that clinical context, and I'm saying this from an organizational and policy point of view, provide a unique opportunity to improve care and increase the development and uptake of innovation in the healthcare system. And this should not be a surprise. It's the fundamental of our industry. And when I say clinic, I say community care intervention, population health intervention, but the level where you try to act on the health of the population. And another small idea is that governing healthcare improvement imply, again, it's biased toward an organizational person, imply the conduct of large-scale organizational development in a healthcare organization where provider and manager collaborate to create, the missing a facilitative context. And the fourth message is that this facilitative context is not totally controlled by organization and provider, but policy and politics have their responsibility around this. Some illustration of this emerging trend, the enthusiasm for quality improvement collaborative, and this is just a paper in the Milbank, but you see it everywhere. The work of the CFHI is an example with the Atlantic Healthcare Collaboration, a specialty of healthcare quarterly will be online or is online now on this experience. Work on high-performing health system that Yves referred to is also paying a lot of attention on renewing organizational form and developing improvement capabilities and developing leadership at the clinical and managerial level. And then all the work on clinical governance, the 4 habits of high-value healthcare organization in the state, to make a chart, what we get from these 3 convergent streams of research and policy, organizational work about improving healthcare system is we need reform more from inside, not just from outside, which means not just from the top or as a reaction from economic cycle and so on. We need a stronger commitment to exploit latent capacity for improvement in the healthcare system, despite persisting, enduring, and it will be an infinite story of some political, institutional, and structural limitation. If I go back to Greg's suggestion, it's I will endorse this 126%, this idea of organization that have more control on the budget for physician compensation, but at the same time, we can do things meanwhile. We don't need to wait to have the ID policy to create movement in the system, and many experience that I refer to in various provinces show this. One of the key messages here is we need to pay more attention to the basis of mobilization within the health system, how we can use evidence for improvement, patient and citizen engagement, and paying more attention to, in the broadest sense of the term, to the management of human resources. I spent a couple of days one time looking at report in different provinces about healthcare reform, report of commission, and the chapter on human resources is something in the end, very brief, not well articulated, and just paying lip service. Oh, by the way, these people will try to implement change and improvement. Okay, we will write 3 pages, and it's done. And this is, and I'm not saying in an ironically way, I think it's an observation. We don't pay enough attention to the way we can mobilize people for improvement. And the subtext of this is, it is where we have some countervailing power on the current logic that drive the system. If you bring patients seriously, and it won't be a revolution, but it's help-changing. If I use an Anglo-Saxon term, it's help-changing the conversation as an example. Using evidence is the same, using performance data. So conclusion, advancing quality through regional clinical governance. I repeat myself because I have some conviction in life. A focus on the development and activation of transformative and improvement capacity should be at least partly, but seriously, the focus of the next stage in different provinces to try to improve the system. We need a more pragmatic approach to healthcare reform, and pragmatism in philosophy built on very simple things. You focus on real problem-solving process, more recognition and nurturing of the distributed capacity in the system, a focus on the creation of enabling context for improvement and change, including incentive, including the proper structure, a reform from within with a reasonable dose of top-down guidance and support. So, to conclude, a political agenda that will be, depending the province, more aligned with tangible transformative and improvement goals. And please take enough time to these goals. It's very different to improve and achieve something if we change every 5 minutes the question in the exam. Attention in reform to both operational challenge and political contingency. Saying differently, we can go deeper on organization, but never forget the political economy in the system. That's why Greg comments so well our stuff. A careful use of structural change to limit the risk of entropy or crowding out if we look at behavioral economic. Massive restructuring can be good sometimes, but it can have a big impact on identity and motivation. So we need to balance both. More attention on how local context and system logic influence the behavior of provider and organization. And this is something that we look at. If you look at situated practice and microclinical context, People are very, in their day-to-day life, influenced in the kind of work environment, their workshop. But at the same time, they are very influenced by the macro stuff through incentive, through accountability regime, through reform, through new legislation decree, and so on. And the importance to rely and to regulate on professional entrepreneurship too. We did project on physician engagement and leadership for health system improvement, and more I like to frame it in terms of professional entrepreneurship. And now, instead of resisting this, we try to make the best out of it and channeling toward public goals more effectively. Thank you. I'm 14 seconds late.
Finally, I'll turn to Greg, and Greg's going to offer some discussion.
And I'll have to be quick because I'm now breaking into your coffee time. So just to answer Jean-Louis's question about the relationship between April and restructuring, I only have a few word response as an old provincial cabinet secretary. It's called the government fiscal year. But and I also have to beware of anyone who says that he's going to be less clever and more optimistic. And so I'm going to try to end on an optimistic note to join Jean-Louis. But when you talk about health system redesign, you're really talking about everything from governance to finance to management to regulation and then delivery. And delivery is part of that. And so it can't really be separated in many respects because they all have knock-on effects with each other. But it is true that you can make changes in terms of governance or financing or regulation and have no impact on quality improvement. Patient responsiveness or population health in general. And that's when you make changes that are more form than function. And that's obviously what we have to watch out for. And so much restructuring has been about, I think, form rather than function. It's tried to get a major change, but really through a mechanism that doesn't go to the heart of the issue. So and I want to agree with Jean-Louis that there really is a balance between stewardship and broad direction on the one hand, and what I will call discretion, flexibility, independence, innovation, and entrepreneurship at the local delivery level. And yeah, it's really, really tough to get that balance right. Right now, we do not have that balance right in this country. And I think there is frustration on both sides of that divide between managers on the one hand and clinicians on the other. So let me end on the optimistic note. Primary care reform in Ontario has gone further than primary care reform in any other province in the country. This has been a real experiment in physician remuneration and contracting, and it's been done in a way to achieve some very important changes. So it's a great start relative to what we have in the rest of the country. Personally, I think it can now be strengthened quite considerably by some governance and structural changes, but the governance changes I already mentioned in terms of a change in accountability. As far as structural changes, minor, because you use the existing structure of the LHINs, but you give them more responsibility, but you also give them a mandate and the discretion to experiment in terms of remuneration and contracting. And so that means both in terms of physicians and other clinicians to actually create a more pluralistic environment than the one that we have now. If Ontario is able to do this, it might actually encourage other provinces to experiment. And here I don't mean change the structures in terms of regionalization. I don't mean Alberta to move to fewer or more regional health authorities or Alberta to change or to dismantle Alberta Health Services, no. But in terms of financing, in terms of some governance changes, in terms of the trust and the delegated authorities to really allow this experimentation and innovation to occur at the service and clinical delivery level. And that's really reform from within, as Jean-Louis says it. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. As Greg mentioned, we've run over. There's one question that's come in online that I'm going to take, and then I think we'll break to give you time for coffee. This question is for Jean-Louis. The person is anonymous. How can actors and organizations, clinicians and managers, engage in initiatives when they are being given very clear mandates from above? This speaks, I think, to some of the points you made at the end of your talk. How can actors and organizations engage in initiatives when they are being given very clear mandates from above?
Okay, well, there is no easy answer to this, but because I'm an optimist, and when I look at different healthcare organizations, I mean in the same provincial system, under major constraint, they somewhat behave differently and do different things. So I think, and Caroline may speak about this too at the end of the day, I'm always working on the assumption that there's still some possible managerial and clinical agency despite strong constraint. And that's why we pay attention to collaborative improvement, restructuring work, developing interprofessional collaboration, developing new ways of working with physicians in private clinic and healthcare organization. I think we have a lot of examples where people develop their agency to do things better despite strong constraint from above. But as Greg said, above can help more sometimes than they do now to give that space.